Good old Terrell Pryor, the only quarterback in NFL history to run a 93-yard touchdown.
20, 10, and Pryor is in, 93 yards.
He was Al Davis's last draft pick, and while mostly forgotten, was a fascinating, if disappointing, mobile quarterback experiment for the Raiders from 2011 to 2013.
Lots of time for Pryor now being chased. Off the pump. Trying to cut back. Throws, it's caught.
And the main reason they have hope for the future is Terrell Pryor.
In college, he was a favorite for the Heisman before getting suspended and watching his records vanish from the books for doing something that the top draft picks all gloat about today. He was one of the first true dual-threat quarterbacks who was, in my opinion, ahead of his time.
Pryor's own coaches don't even know what he's going to do with the ball.
He's one of the only players to ever successfully switch positions.
How difficult was that to tell yourself you're not going to be a quarterback?
But ended his career on an even sadder note than it had started.
What's up, 12? What's up, baby? Hey.
Was he just another Raiders quarterback bust during the pre-Derek Carr years, even donning Jamarcus Russell's number to try to cleanse it of the evil? Or was he just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Needless to say, his troubles all started with one very ill-fated tattoo. Terrell Pryor could have been the next Cam Newton or even better, but one tattoo ruined everything. In Newton's senior season at Auburn, he had 2,854 yards, 30 touchdowns, 7 picks, with 1,400 rushing yards. Newton went on to win the Heisman Trophy. That same year, Pryor as a junior had 2,772 passing yards, 27 touchdowns, 11 picks, with 754 rushing yards. His strikingly similar production to Newton made him a top candidate to win the Heisman the following season in 2011. But none of this mattered after a silly and unnecessary scandal unfolded that would never happen to players today. It's important to remember that in college, Pryor put up unprecedented numbers. His 31-4 record made him the second winningest QB in Ohio State history. He also made Ohio State history as their best mobile QB, with 5 games each featuring 200 passing yards and 100 rushing yards, something no other Ohio State QB had accomplished. Tragically, all of these impressive stats and records were to be wiped away after the Ohio State Buckeyes were sanctioned due to an accidental discovery from an FBI investigation. It's worth mentioning that Pryor grew up in extreme poverty. His mom had 3 or 4 jobs but couldn't afford a house, so they often stayed in motels, a few times even picking the lock of motel rooms out of pure desperation. I only bring this up to highlight how the old college football rules against student athletes profiting off their own names presented very different temptations for players depending on how they grew up and their family's wealth, or lack thereof. Unfortunately for Terrell Pryor, he played football in an era when student athletes were barred from accepting brand deals and sponsorships, gifts, or any monetary payment for using their faces and names. Today, it's the norm, and all prior injustice has long since been forgotten. In 2021, the NCAA changed its rules, finally allowing student athletes to share in the wealth of monetizing themselves. After the 2010 regular season ended, Terrell Pryor and the Buckeyes were on fire. He was set to lead his number 6 ranked team in the Sugar Bowl against Arkansas, ranked at number 8. However, on December 23rd, 2010, it all came crashing down. Pryor and 4 teammates were suspended by the NCAA for the first 5 games of the next season for trading memorabilia like jerseys and championship rings for quote-unquote improper benefits from a tattoo parlor. The owner of the tattoo parlor, Edward Rife, happened to be under investigation by the FBI for drug trafficking, and federal agents discovered his Ohio State memorabilia by sheer accident, igniting a massive scandal.
Rife is currently facing charges of drug trafficking and money laundering. Rife is known as the owner of Fine Line Inc. Tattoos, who received Ohio State football memorabilia. Several items, including Big Ten championship rings, trophies, and OSU uniforms, were discovered during a search of his home.
He's an Ohio State fan, and he'll probably remain a fan.
There had also been rumors that Pryor had sold memorabilia for cash, as well as selling autographed merchandise a la Johnny Manziel. At the time, Pryor apologized for the incident.
Coach Jim Tressel, I'm sorry for what all went down, and I apologize with all my heart for putting you in a situation and taking you out of a job. And I love you just like a father. You taught me a lot. I have 9 more credits left. I'd like to graduate as a Buckeye. In terms of my future, I'm entering the supplemental draft and I'm working hard every single day on the field and off the field to be a better quarterback.
Are you kidding me? Middle round for this guy? For anyone who questions where he's going to be drafted, I expect him to be a first-round pick in the supplemental draft. He is one of the most gifted quarterbacks that the NFL has seen. He is 31-4 at Ohio State. He is 8,000 total yards in 3 years. He holds 59 touchdowns, a record at Ohio State. With all the teams that need QBs, you can't tell me that people are not going to jump on this young man.
The NCAA still allowed Pryor and the rest of the Tattoo Five to play in the upcoming Sugar Bowl, even though they were set to be suspended next year. I guess they did not want the TV ratings to tank in Terrell Pryor's absence. With the scandal haunting him in the background, Terrell Pryor still won Sugar Bowl MVP. One of the great ironies of Tattoo-gate is that the tattoo that essentially ruined his career and forced him to drop out of Ohio State is an Ohio State emblem on his forearm. Way to honor the school that screwed you over. Around this same time, Pryor faced severe criticism for defending someone he modeled his game after, Michael Vick, who'd infamously been busted for running a dogfighting operation. In the Sugar Bowl, Pryor wore Vick on an eye black patch in honor of him. Exhausted after the game and crowded by a press gaggle, he made a pretty embarrassing gaffe while trying to defend Vick.
I just feel that, he made his mistake. Not everybody's a perfect person. Everyone kills people, murder people, and steals from you, steals from me, whatever. I still think he's one of the best quarterbacks.
Yeah, no big deal. Everybody kills people. But he was green and not the best public speaker yet. His suspension for the first 5 games of the 2011 season wrecked his career in ways that would follow him to the NFL. It essentially made him ineligible to enter the NFL draft, plus missing 5 games in his senior season at Ohio State would pretty much be a waste because he would not be able to put up Heisman Trophy numbers or top any of the stats from his junior year. This was so devastating for him because a lot of people thought if he played his senior year, then he would likely be drafted in the first round of the 2012 draft. So sadly, Terrell Pryor would announce that he would not play for the Buckeyes in the 2011 season, citing that he did not want to be a distraction for his teammates. Recently, in 2021, Terrell Pryor and the rest of the Tattoo Five demanded that their records and 12-win season be restored. They were essentially punished for rules that no longer exist. Today's players flaunt their money and brand deals, many of them coming from wealthy upbringings. Despite Reggie Bush's Heisman getting reinstated, Pryor and his Ohio teammates are still being punished for it. So instead, Pryor had to enter the supplemental draft in 2011, which is usually reserved for players with major legal or disciplinary issues. However, this presented an opportunity for the late Raiders owner Al Davis to select Pryor as his final draft pick ever. Thank you to Exter for sponsoring this video. I'm gonna be honest, man, I lose stuff all the time. My wife hates it. And one thing that I've lost before, especially when I'm having a night on the town and getting a little wild, is my wallet, which contains some of the most important stuff. But thankfully, Exter has this new Finder card where you can see the location of your wallet at all times on your iPhone. You'll even get a notification when you're a little too far from your wallet. This Finder card is as small as a credit card, is water resistant, and is rechargeable with a battery that lasts up to 6 months. You can be like me and place the card in your aluminum Exter card holder so you can have all your most important cards safe and in style. Exter is having a sale on Father's Day with products at 40% off. But with my code Wi-Fi Willie, you can get up to 45% off. So click the link in the description and the pinned comment below. Use my promo code Wi-Fi Willie for 45% off Exter wallets. So don't piss your wife off like me, keep your cards safe. In the Maine 2011 draft, Pryor watched Cam Newton get selected in the first round by the Panthers and Colin Kaepernick get selected in the second round by the 49ers. Pryor's famed NFL agent Drew Rosenhaus compared the Ohio State QB to the #1 overall pick Cam Newton and passionately lamented the fact that his client was pushed into the supplemental draft.
Are you kidding me? Middle round for this guy? You talk about Cam Newton being the first pick of the draft and he deserves it? Let me tell you what, I'll make all the comparisons all day long.
17 teams attended Terrell Pryor's pro day. He ran a 4.3 40-yard dash time at a hefty 235 pounds, catching the eye of Raiders owner Al Davis, who famously had a need for speed.
Al Davis told you coming off a third-round pick in the supplemental draft, you were going to be a star.
A year earlier, in 2010, in the Raiders' 50 years of history, they only had one #1 overall draft pick, and they had just released him, Jamarcus Russell, so they desperately needed to turn things around. It made perfect sense that the Raiders selected Pryor in the NFL supplemental draft, sacrificing next year's third-round pick to do so.
So who's Al Davis's last pick? Once upon a time, Terrell Pryor was the most sought-after recruit in the country. That was before anyone heard of Andrew Luck or Cam Newton or RG3 or Russell Wilson.
Pryor was signed only a few weeks before the start of the season, missing the entire offseason. Then, because the NFL commissioner Roger Goodell decided to uphold the NCAA suspension, Pryor was suspended for 5 games. It wasn't until the middle of his 2011 rookie season that Pryor was finally able to practice with the team. Unsurprisingly, he seldom played and sat behind quarterbacks such as Jason Campbell and Carson Palmer. During his first season, the owner, who may have been his biggest advocate, Al Davis, passed away in week 5 of the season. Then, after the 2011 season, Pryor's head coach, Hugh Jackson, was fired. Many thought Hugh Jackson was the perfect head coach to mentor the raw Terrell Pryor because Jackson was an offensive-minded coach. But instead, a young Dennis Allen took over as head coach the following year. About to enter his second season, Pryor already experienced 2 different head coaches. The Raiders played Carson Palmer as the starter in 2012, and Terrell Pryor was only able to start a game at the very end of the season after Palmer suffered a season-ending injury.
His first NFL start, chosen in the 3rd round of the supplemental draft last year. Final pick by the late Al Davis.
Pryor struggled with his accuracy, but still managed to score 3 touchdowns, 2 passing, 1 rushing.
Pryor on the move. Buys some time. Touchdown.
The fact that they started him at the end of the year showed that the franchise was still interested in the QB prospect nearly 2 seasons after signing him to a cheap 4-year, $2 million contract. Adding to the extreme instability he had already experienced on the Raiders, he saw his second offensive coordinator, Greg Knapp, fired after that season. Dennis Allen announced that Greg Olson would take over as offensive coordinator, Pryor's 3rd offensive coordinator in 3 years. On a personal level, 2012 was also a difficult year for Pryor. His father figure and mentor since he was 10 years old, Teddy Sarniak, passed away 6 days before Terrell's wheelchair-bound biological father also passed away. In 2013, the Raiders traded for Matt Flynn from the Seattle Seahawks for a 5th-round pick.
And Richard was thought he'd be the starter in Seattle, but Russell Wilson beat him out. Now with Oakland, Terrell Pryor gets the starting assignment.
Even though many regarded Flynn as the better QB, Pryor's rushing ability gave a team devoid of receiving talent with a subpar O-line an extra chance at making plays. Unfortunately, the Raiders were a team stuck paying dead money contracts for several players who were no longer on the team. Most notably was the contract for quarterback Carson Palmer, who was now on the Arizona Cardinals. Fans did not expect much from the season as they looked to be rebuilding. The first game of the season against the Indianapolis Colts and Andrew Luck featured the typical highs and lows of the Terrell Pryor experience. He made some insane improvised plays and critical runs in key situations.
Lots of time for Pryor now being chased. Off the pump. Trying to cut back. Throws. It's caught.
The game came down to the wire, and it felt like the Raiders were gonna upset the Colts as they marched to the red zone only down 4 points. But with 30 seconds left, Pryor threw an interception that sealed the Raiders' fate. It felt hard to evaluate Pryor because he made key mistakes, but the Raiders' offensive line was horrible and they also lacked great receiving talent. Despite throwing 2 picks in the game, Pryor was the entire offense.
Looks like just the way he runs so effortlessly like Dion used to.
Pryor rushed for 112 yards, the most ever by a Raiders quarterback, and passed for 217 yards, becoming the 7th quarterback in NFL history to throw at least 200 yards and run for at least least 100 in a single regular season game at the time. The team entered the season with low expectations, but Pryor's stellar performance, almost pulling off an improbable upset, gave Raider Nation a jolt of enthusiasm as they entered their first home game against the Jaguars.
Terrell Pryor, do they have something in him, Prime?
Yes, they do.
However, against the Jags, Raiders fans were brought back to reality as Pryor only threw for 126 yards and rushed for 50, while running back Darren McFadden carried the offense. The absolutely trash defense also had to carry the team. Compared to Week 1, Pryor eliminated the turnovers, but we still witnessed warning signs that his lack of throwing ability could cause the offense to stagnate for the rest of the season. Not only was the Raiders' offense devoid of talent, but so was the defense. Their best player may have been the 37-year-old Charles Woodson, who had just been released by Green Bay. So when the Raiders traveled to Denver in Week 3 for Monday Night Football, with former Raiders head coach John Gruden as the broadcaster, they were no match for a Peyton Manning-led offense.
And he's a hard guy to prepare for if you're the Denver Broncos, because Pryor's own coaches don't even know what he's going to do with the ball. It's really a work in progress. He has a long way to go, but he is surely athletic.
Manning had a career-high 86.5 completion percentage. The Broncos defense clamped down on Pryor's rushing attack, limiting him to just 36 yards, but he did throw 281 yards in mostly garbage time since the score was 27-7 at halftime. Even though the Raiders were creamed by the Broncos, Denver was considered a Super Bowl contender, and the turnover-free stats Terrell posted gave fans more optimism around the 23-year-old quarterback. But the most significant moment in the game was when Pryor was knocked out in the fourth quarter and suffered a concussion. As much as Raiders fans wanted to forget that horrific loss, Pryor wrote on Twitter at the time that he does not remember much from the game at all. But this concussion allowed the Raiders to see what life would be like without Pryor the following week, as the injury ruled him out the next game against the Redskins. Matt Flynn got the nod to start for the injured Terrell Pryor at home against the RG3-led Redskins in head coach Mike Shanahan's final game against the Raiders. This guy has a deep beef with late Raiders owner Al Davis that we'll have to get into another day. But Dennis Allen and the Raiders saw life without Pryor. The Raiders tried to see if Terrell could play all the way up till the night before the game. The Redskins entered the game 0-3 while the Raiders were 1-2. The Raiders were up 14-0 in the first quarter, but Flynn threw a pick six, something Pryor had not done all year. The backup QB was also sacked 7 times, the most for a Raiders quarterback in a single game since Andrew Walter 7 years before. Terrell Pryor came back the following week for a home matchup against the San Diego Chargers in Week 5. This game went down as the latest primetime game in West Coast history.
Well, it's 2:45 a.m. on the East Coast. I hope you stayed up for the Raiders and the Chargers.
That means if you're watching on the East Coast, it's almost midnight when the game starts. This happened due to delays from switching the Oakland Coliseum from its baseball configuration to a football one. The whole world saw Terrell Pryor in primetime in what was his best passing game of his career.
Pryor to throw it. Pryor, it's caught! Touchdown! Rod Streeter in traffic, and the Raiders strike quickly.
Dennis Allen praised Pryor's ability to extend plays when things break down, as the Raiders had a 17-0 lead at halftime, their largest margin at home since 2002. After losing the previous week without Terrell, then upsetting Phillip Rivers and the Chargers in prime time, many started to believe Pryor was the real deal, including the Raiders.
And the main reason they have hope for the future is Terrell Pryor, Al Davis's final draft pick, his last big stamp on this team, and these fans tell me he is the reason they have a belief in the future, Chris.
Terrell's performance was so good that the Raiders cut quarterback Matt Flynn, the guy they just traded for back in the offseason. Dennis Allen said Pryor was quote-unquote leaps and bounds ahead of where we thought he would be, and that it was best to move on from Flynn now that they had their starter. It appeared like the Raiders finally found their franchise quarterback to build around. So how the hell did they end up benching him just 6 weeks later? When the Raiders traveled to Kansas City to face the undefeated Chiefs, led by quarterback Alex Smith and head coach Andy Reid, all of their hype came to a screeching halt. The Raiders dealt with O-line issues, starting a third-string center. Although they kept the score tied 7-7 at halftime, Pryor and the patchwork offensive line collapsed and lost the game for them. Terrell was sacked a whopping 10 times throughout the game, and in the second half alone, he threw 3 interceptions, causing the Raiders to lose 24-7. This game displayed how Pryor had a long way to go as he cracked while under pressure, holding on to the ball too long, taking unnecessary sacks, and panicking, leading to costly turnovers. During the bye week, Pryor continued to work with quarterback guru Tom House. He had been working with the trainer since the offseason when he admitted he never knew how to throw the ball before the 2013 season. This showed how tough of a task it was for Terrell to improve as an NFL passer, since in college he mainly coasted off of his athletic ability. The following week, in Week 8, the Raiders won at home against Ben Roethlisberger and the Pittsburgh Steelers. This game featured a historic 93-yard touchdown run by Terrell Pryor.
Hand off, it's Pryor. Lot of real estate to the 30. Pryor is off and running. Inside Steelers territory. 20, 10, and Pryor is in. 93 yards.
As of 2024, this play is still the longest rushing play by a quarterback in NFL history. Pryor is forever remembered in the record books. Most fans only remember that highlight from the game, but the Raiders at the time were fully aware that Pryor only threw for 88 yards and threw 2 interceptions in the game, and they barely won due to 2 missed field goals by the Steelers and Pryor's insane run. So while outside the building it felt like Pryor bounced back, internally their confidence in the mobile QB was deteriorating. The Raiders defense gave Pryor no favors in a Week 9 loss to Nick Foles and the Eagles. Foles would tie the single-game NFL passing touchdown record with 7. The Raiders offense could not keep up with the Eagles despite gaining 560 yards, their third most since 1968 at the time. But Pryor's costly 2 interceptions in the second half did not help either. The quarterback had thrown 7 picks in the last 3 games. Pryor left the game with a knee injury, but claimed it was stable afterwards. It was not obvious he had the injury in the Week 10 game against the New York Giants. But shockingly, Terrell Pryor revealed to the media that he had sprained his MCL the week before in the Eagles game, but played in the Giants game anyway. He also shockingly revealed that he hid how serious the injury was from the coaching staff. This upset Dennis Allen, and Terrell later stated, "That's a moment I wish I would have handled differently." The young QB was desperately trying to prove that his first 4 games were not a fluke. However, with the loss to the Giants, the Raiders fell to a 3-6 record. Pryor, who was now battling injuries, had multiple turnovers in each of his last 4 starts, plus the Raiders were not financially tied to him. If Terrell Pryor had been a first-round pick, a franchise would be financially tied to him and try to make it work with him. But instead, he was viewed as expendable, and with injuries now available as an excuse, the Raiders decided to start undrafted free agent Matt McGloin for the remainder of the season. They claimed McGloin was in for Pryor until he got healthy, and also to evaluate McGloin. But it was clear the Raiders were eyeing a quarterback in the 2014 NFL draft. The situation was out of Terrell Pryor's control, and he said, quote, "It is what it is." The Raiders went on to only win 1 game the rest of the season, ending with a 4-12 record. But surprisingly, Dennis Allen decided to start Pryor in the season finale to evaluate the quarterback, since they had already seen enough of Matt McGloin. Pryor's agent blasted the decision, saying he thinks the Raiders are sabotaging Terrell in order to make McGloin look good. Allen criticized the allegation, saying it's the stupidest thing ever. Terrell apologized for his agent and seemed pissed off that he said that. The following year, he would cut ties with that same agent who made that ridiculous comment about the Raiders and Dennis Allen. In his final game as an Oakland Raider, nothing significant happened as the Peyton Manning-led Broncos defeated the Raiders. Pryor looked rusty, missing open receivers, but was also the entire run game for the Raiders with 49 yards. Pryor eventually requested a trade the following offseason once it was clear the team was moving on. Just a few years ago, he was selected by the late owner Al Davis and was viewed as a raw athletic quarterback prospect that could be developed by the offensive-minded head coach Hugh Jackson. He watched other teams cater their offense around mobile QBs like Cam Newton, RG3, Brady, Russell Wilson, and Colin Kaepernick. Who knows how things could have turned out if he was put in a position to play earlier, not sidelined by Carson Palmer, and actually develop as a passer. Terrell Pryor's unfortunate quarterback career was not only set back by losing his biggest advocate in Al Davis, but also because he was too ahead of his time. The mobile QBs we mentioned earlier had just arrived on the scene. Many believed a prospect like Pryor could flourish in the NFL today, with teams utilizing QBs like Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Anthony Richardson. Pryor's physical traits may have been better than all of them. However, Pryor was still a quarterback in the NFL for 2 years before becoming a starter, and still hadn't developed as a passer. We later learned that he knew deep down he was in over his head as an NFL quarterback. The Raiders ended up trading Pryor to the Seattle Seahawks for basically nothing, a 7th-round pick. The Raiders, still under Dennis Allen, the current head coach of the New Orleans Saints, had his heart set on a new franchise quarterback from the 2nd round of the 2014 draft, Derek Carr. I was at the preseason game in 2014 when Pryor and the Seahawks faced the Oakland Raiders. I even posted this picture on Instagram on my horrible smartphone, still having delusional hope in Terrell, with my caption, "Best quarterback ever." That did not age well. But this was not the end of Terrell's career. There would be some shocking twists and turns, one nearly ending deadly. After 2014, Pryor ended up floating around on a few teams, most notably the Kansas City Chiefs, 2 years before they drafted Patrick Mahomes. The only news he made while on the Chiefs was witnessing 2 people get shot at a mall. Later on, the Chiefs and the Bengals dropped him as quarterback, and so his agent saw an interesting opportunity to kickstart his career, switch positions.
Just me using my athleticism. Some of the guys are called freaky athletic, and it helps you stay, helps people want you to be around.
It is almost impossible to pull this off at the professional level, and he's one of the few players who did.
But how difficult was that to tell yourself you're not going to be a quarterback?
Just realize, it's not going to work. The chances aren't there. It's hard, but you also got to check your ego. And I had to check myself and say, not working at QB, had a good run, good try. At least I tried. But, let's move on to something else that's going to keep me on the field and playing the game that I love to death.
He reunited with his first NFL coach, Hugh Jackson, head coach of the Cleveland Browns, though now as a wide receiver. At one point on the Browns, he played 3 different positions in one game, ending the year with a 1,000-yard season. It was the only real stability he ever experienced, and he finally seemed to have found his true calling.
I just think it comes down, to the relationship with the coaches. As a quarterback, I don't feel like I ever had a relationship with any of my coaches I had, since college.
You remember I drafted him with Al Davis when he came out to Oakland. Couldn't do any football for 6 weeks, and he wanted to be a quarterback. That's what he really believed he was. Last year when he was with me in Cincinnati for a little while, and I didn't have enough confidence to ask him to change positions at that time, and that's why we let him go, to be very honest with you. He needs to play receiver and do it full time. He made that decision, and he's never looked back.
Finally finding success on the Cleveland Browns, a sentence rarely uttered for any player, he was able to turn it into a 1-year, $8 million deal with the Washington Redskins in 2017. Even though he was technically on the Chiefs once, he was heckled by Chiefs fans later on while on the Redskins.
Do something, 12! Do something, baby! Hey! Do something, 12!
Once a Raider, always a Raider. Injuries ultimately led to less playing time and lower contracts as he floated as a journeyman for a couple years. He was finally released by the Jags after being placed on IR before the 2019 season. His career ended in a whimper. From then on, the only time he made the news was for the wrong reasons. Following a night out drinking in November 2019, Pryor headed home, but his then girlfriend, Shalea Briston, stayed out, causing an argument later that night. She ended up stabbing him multiple times in the chest and left arm, hitting an artery. He flatlined twice on the hospital bed, but thankfully survived. Shockingly, they stayed together, and 2 years later, when, once again, Briston refused to come home from the club after Pryor blew up her phone, he angrily threw pumpkins at her car. Yeah, he went full Green Goblin mode. Hopefully, they've since worked things out or moved on. In 2020, he hinted at a comeback, but said it was difficult to meet with teams because of the pandemic.
5 teams, they spoke to the Patriots last week. I mean, a lot of the teams are not really dealing with players because of the COVID situation.
He also admitted that injuries ultimately made it hard to get signed anywhere, injuries which worsened because he chose to play through them out of desperation.
It was really just my injuries, I mean, I can still play, I can still make plays and dominate. They got to see that I can stay healthy. Tore my groin actually week 2 and I played through it. That's the only thing that really helped me back.
Pryor was clearly an athletic freak who started his professional career on the wrong foot after his risky gamble with NCAA violations. That set off a chain reaction which sent him to a dysfunctional team trying to dig itself out of a decade of failure and the death of their legendary owner. We still have so many questions. What if Al Davis, his only advocate, had survived? What if he had been eligible for the draft and been taken in the first round, motivating a team to develop him and build around him? Where does the Raiders' dysfunction end and Terrell Pryor's bad play really begin? The Raiders had a horrible roster around him at the time, but when he was asked if he would return as a quarterback in 2020, he said hell no.
So you want to go back to playing QB or you're still a receiver?
I'm going to get 1,000 yards this year, bro.
Maybe he knew he was never cut out to be a quarterback all along, but a lot of players get chewed up and unceremoniously spit out in the cold business of the league, and Pryor was no exception. Perhaps we'll never know the true potential of any player who finds himself in a bad situation. If you're still watching at this point in the video, let me know in the comments below. My name is Wi-Fi Willie. Peace out, and I hope you have a good one.